This is Hidden Killers Live with Tony Bruschi, Stacey Cole, and Todd Michaels.
Alan Jackson is Nick Reiner's defense attorney. Yes, that Alan Jackson from the Karen Reed case. He said very publicly there are, quote, very complex and serious issues in this case, and urged the public not to rush to judgment. That's defense attorney code for something. The question is what? Nick Reiner has a documented decades-long history of severe addiction. He's been in and out of rehab since age 15, at least 17 stints by the time he was 22. He's spoken openly about meth, heroin, homelessness, psychotic episodes while using. His own father directed that semi-autobiographical film about his struggle. And then just 10 days before the killings, a family friend described him as being on the upswing, looking healthy, in good spirits. So what happened? And how does defense attorney Eric Faddis believe the defense will try to reframe this? He's here with us to help break it all down. Is this going to be not necessarily, pitched as cold-blooded homicide? Obviously, the defense doesn't want it to look that way. That's what the prosecution's going to be looking at. But is it something else entirely? Defense attorney Alan Jackson, like we said, made that statement. Very complex and serious issues in this case. Based on what's publicly known, what defense strategies do you think are already being considered here by good old AJ?
Yeah, that statement, in addition to postponing the arraignment, not once, but twice, it's already been postponed twice, tells me a few things. Because typically at an arraignment, at least down the line, the defense is going to have to enter a plea. Is it going to be guilty? Is it going to be not guilty? Is it going to be not guilty by reason of insanity? Well, you don't want to enter that plea of not guilty by reason of insanity and then walk it back later. So you kind of have to have your ducks in a row. And my apprehension is that Alan Jackson is looking into that, probably having mental health experts analyze and evaluate his client even in these very early stages, such that he's teeing up his potential defense. Could be not guilty by reason of insanity, could be some kind of psychotic break, could be an accident, could be some heat of passion sort of mitigator. I think there's a lot of avenues that they're likely exploring at this time.
Is the postponement of any of this theatrics? Is it? I mean, maybe it works hand in hand. Maybe it's a little bit of you can't, you don't want to walk something back, so you might as well take some extra time if it's available to you, and it appears to be. In the theatrics of, well, he's not well enough to make this arraignment here 2 days in a row. Now we're going to do it in January, and then it buys him some time for some of those evaluations. Is it more than theatrics, I guess would be the word?
Could be a combination of both. And what I mean is that the postponement of the arraignments, that could be for a number of reasons. It could be oftentimes, I'm not saying this would happen here, but oftentimes a person is going through drug withdrawals and they're just not physically healthy enough to go to court. Sure. However, perhaps Alan Jackson's looking at this and saying, hey, my client was not mentally fit enough to go to court, not once, but twice. And they got him in the suicide vest here. And then when you add on a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, well, you've sort of built up the precursors to that. And you can use that later on to the jury, or at least try to, by saying, hey, he couldn't even make his first 2 court appearances because he was so mentally disturbed immediately after and contemporaneous with this happened.
How often, I found this interesting. I don't have much experience in seeing people in suicide vests, so maybe you can help answer this for me in a courtroom. How often is it that they don't appear to have a shirt on underneath the suicide vest? Is that normal? Because, to me, it was kind of like, that's your top today.
Yeah, sadly, I've seen a lot of different presentations of folks who are purportedly experiencing issues like that. And sometimes it's even more unnatural looking. Sometimes they have like a spit guard over their face. Sometimes they are shackled and bound so they don't try to injure somebody else. But certainly when you look at that photo, if you're defense, you're like, that guy looks kind of crazy. That might be part of the defense and part of the presentation to the world.
That's, I guess, part of my question. Who makes the call? Who makes the call of putting him in the suicide vest? Who makes the call of how he's going to look in court? I mean, I know they didn't want him on camera. According to Alan Jackson, you didn't want it, that version of him shown, so he was kind of behind some glass. It was very difficult to see him, other than from the stenographer or the court artist's renderings there. But who makes the call? Is Alan Jackson making the call, going, my client needs to be in a suicide vest, let's get him on him? Or who's making the choice here for this portion of the show?
Usually it's the jail deputies who make that ultimate decision. However, and I'm not saying Alan Jackson did this at all, but just thinking about possibilities, if they weren't going to if they were just going to have him in regular jail garb, and they got a call from the defense attorney saying, hey, look, this guy might kill himself or he might hurt somebody else. You will need to take precautionary measures to make sure that doesn't happen. Well, that might persuade the jail in an abundance of caution to cover their own ass by putting him in this kind of garb, which might just, lo and behold, support sort of the narrative defense may intend to present.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, and I'm not saying that all this might not be completely necessary. It probably likely is very necessary. I'm just looking at this from the perspective of Alan Jackson is a very good strategic attorney, and if he's going to play a card, he's going to play it well. So I'm just kind of looking at all this of how much is theatrics, how much is literally this is the cards that he's been dealt with. From what we know about Nick here in this case, Nick Reiner. He has a documented history of severe drug addiction, including meth and heroin and past psychotic episodes while using. How might the defense use that history to argue diminished capacity or lack of premeditation? How well does that all play into insanity? And especially in California here, what are the prerequisites here? Is it a high bar to reach the insanity defense in California? Some states don't even have it. Do you know what it's going to be like out there in California for them?
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge. And as C Legal Canada indicated in one of the comments, you can't just take a bunch of drugs and commit a crime and get off scot-free. That's not how it works. However, there are ways that such a history can contribute to certain defenses, including not guilty by reason of insanity, which usually requires a mental disease or defect that causes a person to not know right from wrong in the moment. So, was there some sort of drug psychosis that kicked in? After years of substance abuse, was there some sort of mental condition that was developed, like schizophrenia or some extreme paranoia, those kinds of things? And so, while it's not a defense in and of itself, I imagine it's going to be used towards trying to get Nick off or at least mitigate the possible circumstances. Still a very high bar to show he didn't know right from wrong in the moment. And yet it can't be only drugs that, caused him to get there. It's got to be a culmination of mental health and other histories, trauma, things like that.
So going back to something that Tony had said about being high profile and things like that, I imagine Alan Jackson's got to ride a very fine line here. He can't villainize the parents and turn this into, whatever happened at that party escalated this situation. Rob Reiner is a beloved figure in our world. I mean, I'm hearing people talk about Princess Bride and Sleepless in Seattle. And I mean, just over and over talking about just what a beloved figure he is. So he's going to have to ride this really careful line and make it appear that Nick is the one who had the problem, that it wasn't the parents who contributed to this. Don't you think?
I'm right there with you, Stacey. Rob Reiner and his wife are very sympathetic victims. It's not like they're, it's not like the accusations against the Menendez brothers' parents, at least not yet. We don't know what the accusations against the parents might be. So I guess we'll have to see. But you've got to be kind of delicate in terms of blaming the victim or appearing to do so. I think placing the emphasis on Nick's personal challenges, at least for the time being, is the right avenue.
Let's talk about that for a second, because that has run through my mind. I'm curious. I've seen other people speculate. what roads could possibly be gone down by the defense? A lot of us, we're looking, okay, is he insane? Is it the drugs? Or are they going to go down some road of, again, and we have no evidence of anything of this sort, and I feel like it might be pulled out of thin air if it is. Abuse. Right. Or this, or that, or whatever bizarro allegation that could completely stain the legacy and the story of Rob Reiner and his storied career without very much of a foundational basis. I guess my question is, how much of a foundational basis would have to be met to go down some of those roads if they were to say, well, he was abused at this age and this happened and that happened and they did this and they did that. I'm not saying they're going to, but they're dead. So they can't really stand up for themselves. They have the other siblings who could be like, that's bullshit.
Yep.
But how much do you have to prove before you go down a road of utter insanity? I mean, look at the Karen Reed case. This theory is that these cops beat him up in the house. There's no evidence of it. And I'm not going to Karen Reed's guilt or innocence. I'm just saying it was a story made out of thin air. And it was able to be argued in court. And it influenced a jury. Who's to say they couldn't say Chloe the dog was involved too in this? I mean, it's just, where's the bar here? And what where do they have to reach before they can start pulling shit out of their ass and saying this is real?
Sure, and let me just say, all the information I've reviewed indicates that the Reiners were great parents and tried to help this kid. I don't personally know, but when a life in prison is on the line, or possibly the death penalty, people are going to look at every possible out they can. Here, what that would require, it's essentially a self-defense claim. Like in the Menendez brothers case, they're kind of saying the abuse happened frequently over time. It had such a cumulative effect that the child was scared that it would continue happening, and he felt that he had to do this in order to stop that from happening. In terms of the threshold to meet, defense doesn't have to meet a high threshold. It's really just some colorable evidence that is supporting such a claim. And then when that happens, in most jurisdictions, the burden shifts to the prosecution to disprove it. And so how in the world would if such an allegation arose, how in the world would the prosecution disprove it? Like you said, they could call the other siblings to say, hey, that's BS. But gosh, if you have one sibling who is just saying, hey, this happened behind closed doors, there's no photos of it, that's not how these things go down, that's a hard thing to disprove.
That's what I'm worried about.
Makes my stomach turn even thinking that could come out.
Well, and look, and if that's what I'm wondering about, is that bar there is what he just has to basically come out of Nick's mouth, and then somehow it's fact. And can be argued as fact. That's kind of scary, that there doesn't have to be any sort of real evidence supporting an accusation like that. And look, and if there were to be an and there is evidence of something, and again, there's no evidence pointing to any, this is just pure speculation of thinking, where could they go with this? If there is some sort of evidence for anyone doing anything horrible, yes, that should be exposed. Your history be damned if there is anything there. But if there's not, the fact that a known addict, manipulator, liar, piece of shit could just basically say something like that out loud, and then it could be run with in court, it's kind of a scary proposition.
Yeah, no, it's troubling to think about, and it's in part a function of our Constitution and how our court system is set up. And what I mean is that the defense doesn't have a burden at trial. They don't have to come up with some prior allegation of abuse and prove that to a jury. It's not their job. It's the prosecution's job to prove guilt and typically to disprove affirmative defenses like self-defense. And so, courts usually require a little something more than just the defendant saying it. They might require some kind of corroborative thing. Did the defendant ever text anybody about this, email somebody about it? In the Menendez case, there was this alleged letter that one of the Menendez brothers sent to a cousin purporting to reference this abuse. Typically, it's like a statement plus, but but not always. And still, that plus is a pretty small plus.
Well, and here's the other interesting part to think about when you're dealing with an addict. They're going to lie, and I'm sure he has a history and a documented history of lying, cheating, saying whatever the hell he needs to say to someone to manipulate them to get his way. Yeah. So it's not a crazy bridge that far to think that maybe somewhere along the line of the last 20 years, he's made a claim like that to somebody to get sympathy, to get empathy, when his parents had said, good luck, there's nothing more we can do for you. People make shit up. That, I don't know. I'm concerned in that area, not because I think the Reiners did anything like that. I do not believe that Rob Reiner or his wife or that family were anything of that ilk. In fact, just quite the opposite. But when you get really vile people involved in something like this, really vile things can take place. Who knows? I'm just talking about that road for a moment because I don't think anybody's really gone down it yet. If we're talking about a drug-induced psychosis here, because you have two different types. You have someone who is a psychopath, someone where it's just in them, it's not going away. Then you have something where it's induced, something where this is either part of a mental illness or something that's induced from a substance. How far down the insanity road does that play? Is that a strong argument? If it's a drug-induced psychosis, this made him do it. Had he been in his right mind, he wouldn't have done it. Couldn't the prosecution argue back? Yes, and you chose to do those drugs, and you have a history of this, of being psychotic or having drug-induced psychosis episodes. So you made that choice. You pulled the trigger on yourself, basically, by taking those drugs, and this is the consequences of your actions, whether you remember them or not.
Sure. And what we're touching on is the fact that as a general rule, voluntary intoxication is not a defense. Like I said, You can't just take a bunch of drugs, commit a bunch of crimes, and then get off scot-free. It's not how it works. However, if there has been, years, if not decades of methamphetamine abuse, for example, that can change a person's brain. That can give rise to or influence or contribute to a mental disease or defect that is diagnosable, and that can I guess in theory, might serve as some kind of part of an insanity defense. It couldn't be that he just did a bunch of drugs that day and freaked out. Like, that's not going to be a defense. But if he abused meth over the course of years and developed this severe paranoia such that he is detached from reality, whether he's using drugs or not, and then this thing happened, that could be a mental disease or defect that could impair a person's ability to know right from wrong, or at least the defense might style it like that.
Well, it looks like an institutional failure. He's been in 17 times and they couldn't fix him. So what could be done? I mean, it looks like they've got a lot of boxes checked for this insanity plea if that's the road they go down.
Sure. And I mean, if you're defense, I think you're looking at that and saying, hey, for how long has this young man been troubled? For how long has he been afflicted by these issues? Look at how horrible it's rendered his life. He's the son of this famous movie director, and he was homeless at times. Like, you better believe that this contributed to his mental state. I'm just saying what defense is saying. That's not my personal opinion. But there are certainly arguments that will be made based on the history of Nick and what he has dealt with and what some people might say what he's done to himself.
I want to talk about, you mentioned institutional failure, Stacey, and I don't think it's institutional failure. It's the failure of the addict to accept any sort of treatment at the end of the day. You can have, and this is a prime example of it. They've tried some of the best, all of them, anything they possibly could, and he would not get with the program. At the end of the day, it is up to the addicts to get with the program, to make the choices that they need in their life to get better. The institution can only go so far and do so much. Is that something that can be argued in court as well if they try to go down that road?
I'm not sure how much traction they would get on something like that, because, we all have institutions that fail us, some folks more than others. And that's not something that I can go to a jury and be like, hey, this guy got a bunch of crummy breaks, man. So, So find him not guilty of stabbing his parents.
Yeah.
Like there's just a disconnect there, and I think that juries looking at it might say, "Screw that, man. We all have to deal with shit."
Sure. If the prosecution does pursue the death penalty, what sort of mitigating factors would you expect the defense to present during the actual penalty phase of this? And how effective are addiction and mental health histories in California capital cases in terms of getting somebody off of death row or never getting on it in the first place?
The substance abuse road in terms of mitigation and death penalty can be a double-edged sword because, some folks might be judgmental about that. Or if not, they might not be judgmental, but they might say, hey, you did that to yourself, man. Mm-hmm. That's not that's something that makes you less morally culpable here. On the other hand, I think there are likely going to be mitigating factors. One is age. Nick was not, he was a rather young man. I don't know about his criminal history. I know he's had a history with drug use. But if he hasn't been convicted, if he hasn't racked up a bunch of convictions, a lack of criminal history can be a mitigating factor. Mm-hmm. And I'm just completely speculating, but if there was some kind of prior trauma or mistreatment by the decedents, that could be something that is brought up. The fact that he didn't kill any children or more than two people, sometimes they really get down to the nitty gritty in terms of this could have been a lot worse.
He only killed two people. He was at a party with a bunch of celebrities and could have gone batshit crazy is probably what you're thinking, right?
Potentially. I mean, a hard argument to make, maybe not one I'd make, but I'm just saying they look at, they might say, hey, you look at the Aurora Theater shooting, that guy killed 10 plus people. He didn't get the death penalty. Don't give this guy the death penalty.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dang. It's like at least I'm not that bad. Quite type of argument. Nick Reiner's arraignment now pushed to January 7th. What do you think the defense is doing right now behind the scenes to prepare, and what's the first major battle that they're going to have to fight here come the 7th?
Sure. So I think that they are likely having their mental health experts evaluate Nick. I think they are pulling all historical, medical, and rehab records to review anything in his past that could have explained what happened or could be a part of an insanity defense. On top of that, they got to prove that Nick did this, and they got to prove what happened in there. I saw See Legal Canada mention it's likely not an accident, and that very well could be. But you got to prove it's not an accident. You got to prove it wasn't self-defense. Now, those things might seem far-fetched, but when we're talking about death penalty litigation, they're going to leave no stone unturned. And the prosecution's got to prove up those facts. And when you only have 1 out of 3 of the people alive still who know what happened in that house, that can be harder than you think.
It's going to be fascinating. So many questions, so many unanswered questions in this, and time is really what is going to tell what takes place next here. Eric Faddis, defense attorney, former prosecutor, as always, thank you so much for coming on and giving us your insight onto this case. You guys let us know what you think in the comment section on YouTube. If you're not already there, search Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi, and press subscribe while you're at it so you don't miss any of our coverage. We're going to keep following this all the way through. Until next time, for Eric, for Todd, for Stacy, I'm Tony Bruschi. We'll talk again real soon.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Bruschi and the Hidden Killers podcast.